In the golden twilight of Rome's ruins, marble columns stand as the eternal symbols of empire, of senators, legions, and Caesars who once ruled the known world. But before Rome ever cast its shadow across Europe, another civilization had already mastered the art of empire building. An empire so vast, so organized, and so ahead of its time that even Rome borrowed from its blueprint. 2,000 years before Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the Persians, a people once scattered across the highlands of Iran, forged the first true world empire. From the banks of the Indus River to the shores of the Aegean Sea, their domain stretched across continents, cultures, and climates. It was a realm held together not by fear alone, but by a remarkable system of tolerance, law, and innovation. Under the banners of kings like Cyrus the Great and Darius I, Persia became more than a conqueror's dream. It was a living network of roads, couriers, and ideas. Messages could travel from one end of the empire to another in mere days. Gold coins flowed across lands where dozens of languages were spoken. And in the heart of it all stood Persepolis, a city carved in stone to mirror the empire's unity and majesty. Yet history is selective in its memory. Rome's glory endured in Western consciousness, while Persia's legacy faded into whispers, remembered more for its wars with Greece than for the civilization it built. But to truly understand the story of empire, its rise, its purpose, and its fragility, one must begin not in Rome, but in the deserts of ancient Iran. This is the story of the Achaemenid Empire, the forgotten superpower that ruled the ancient world long before Rome, a civilization that shaped how humanity would govern, trade, and dream of greatness for millennia to come.
The story begins not in palaces or on marble staircases, but on high, wind-swept plateaus, where the seasons themselves seem to carve a people into being. The Iranian Plateau, a harsh, beautiful sweep of mountains, salt flats, and semi-arid plains, was home to small kinship groups whose lives were shaped by migration, horses, and the fragile economies of pastoralism. These were not yet an empire. They were clans, adaptable, fiercely loyal to kin, attentive to the weather and to neighbors, and ready to seize opportunity when it came. From this landscape came the Persians, one of several Indo-Iranian peoples who settled the region in antiquity. Their story is at once ordinary and improbable. Ordinary because it begins with familiar elements of human social life: family ties, cattle, seasonal movement, and alliances with stronger neighbors. Improbable because within a few generations, these same people would unify vast territories under a single political vision and give the world a prototype for imperial rule. To understand that leap, it helps to see the Persian transformation as a series of converging pressures and choices. First, geography. The Iranian plateau sits at the crossroads of Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, Anatolia, and Central Asia. Any group living there would be exposed to trade routes, technologies, and the politics of larger states. Second, social flexibility. The Persians' kin-based structures could scale. A charismatic leader could turn clan obligations into broader coalitions, binding distant groups with marriage ties, patronage, and promises of plunder or protection. Third, the presence of great neighbors, notably the Medes and the earlier civilizations of Mesopotamia and Elam, created both a model to imitate and a power to resist. At first, Persians appear in the shadow of the Medes. The Median polity, centered to the northwest, had created a regional order in which many smaller peoples, including the Persians, were client groups or subordinates. The Medes had formed a crude imperial umbrella, projecting influence across the plateau. For the Persians, this was a double-edged sword. Median suzerainty limited their independence, but it also exposed Persian elites to the mechanics of rule. Under Median hegemony, Persian chieftains learned how tribute was collected, how alliances were made, and how kings maintained legitimacy. They absorbed administrative habits and diplomatic vocabularies that would later be repurposed on a much larger scale. Culture and religion mattered too. The spiritual landscape of early Persia is complex, layered with pre-Zoroastrian beliefs, folk practices, and the gradual influence of the prophet Zarathustra, Zoroaster. While historians still debate the exact dating and early influence of Zoroastrian ideas, it is clear that the emerging Persian elite drew on shared moral vocabularies about justice, kingship, and cosmic order. The idea that a ruler should be legitimate, just, and protective of order, frequently framed in terms of truth versus chaos, provided a language that a unifying dynasty could use to justify rule beyond the narrow confines of kinship. Material culture and technology also played their part. The Persians were horse people. Mobility and the effective use of cavalry gave them advantages in communication and war across difficult terrain. They adopted military tools and tactics from neighbors, bronze, then iron weapons, chariots in earlier eras, and later cavalry and mounted archery. Equally important, they engaged in trade. Long before there was a royal road, there were caravan routes threading the plateau. Goods and ideas flowed. Metalworking techniques, artistic motifs, and administrative practices that would later be refined into the mechanisms of empire. Leadership is the hinge on which history often turns. In the Persian case, leaders from a particular lineage, the Achaemenid house, began to accumulate the forms of authority that could weld clans into a polity. The story handed down by ancient sources and preserved in later histories is both mythic and plausible. Names like Achaemenes, Cambyses, and others mark a genealogy that the Persians used to claim continuity and noble origin. Whether every detail of those genealogies is literal truth matters less than the political fact. A recognized house, with recognized rites and rituals, can centralize power. Rituals of kingship, marriage alliances, and the redistribution of booty all reinforced status.
Contact with older civilizations, Elam in the southwest, Assyria and Babylonia to the west, gave Persians a set of institutional templates. These were not simple acts of copying. A Persian chieftain who had observed Babylonian scribes, for example, could see the value of record-keeping. One who traded with Lydian merchants could appreciate coinage and markets. What the Persians did was selective adoption, taking lessons that suited their social and environmental reality and discarding elements that did not. Economics, as ever, was decisive. Pastoral groups who could control valley resources, mountain passes, and seasonal pastures could translate that control into sustained wealth. Wealth underwrote loyalty. It paid for retainers, for mercenaries, for the trappings of kingship. It funded marriages that knitted rival houses together. Slowly, these repeated transactions hardened into institutions, tribute systems, proto-taxation, and centralized courts that could adjudicate disputes across communities. The impulse to stabilize income streams pushed elites towards systems that were less about periodic plunder and more about predictable revenue, the embryonic logic of a state. Language and identity evolved as well. The early Persians spoke an Indo-Iranian tongue closely related to the languages of their neighbors, but political expansion brought them into contact with many tongues: Elamite administrative idioms, Aramaic as a lingua franca of the Near East, and local dialects of subject peoples. This multilingual environment would later become a strength. The Persians learned to rule through tolerance and pragmatic accommodation rather than forced assimilation. Allowing local religions, laws, and customs to persist under Persian oversight reduced friction and lowered the political cost of domination. One feature worth underscoring: the Persian approach to power was often pragmatic rather than ideological. Conquest was rarely aimed at cultural annihilation. It aimed to integrate resources and administrations into a profitable system. When a new region was absorbed, local elites were frequently co-opted. The Persians placed satraps, provincial governors, who could be Persian or local, depending on who would best secure loyalty and revenue. The use of local elites reduced administrative strain and made governance more durable. This pragmatism created a patchwork empire held together by overlapping obligations instead of a single homogenizing policy. These foundations did not produce an empire overnight. The birth of Persia was incremental, a ladder of small conquests, strategic marriages, and opportunistic alliances. It was a process of social engineering conducted largely by a few ambitious families who understood that power could be institutionalized. They learned that a ruler who could promise security, justice, and predictable revenue could outmatch the unstable coalitions of rival chieftains. By the mid-6th century BCE, those cumulative choices began to translate into something qualitatively new. A house that had once been one among many in the highlands now projected power across wider territories. Their leaders began to imagine sovereignty that reached beyond the plateau, control of trade routes, influence over rich agricultural plains, and a crown that could claim legitimacy not only through lineage but through service to order and prosperity. The Persian ascent reminds us of a broader truth about state formation. Geography, social flexibility, economic incentives, exposure to neighboring institutions, and decisive leadership coalesced to produce outcomes far larger than the sum of any single cause. In the hands of the right leader, and here history will reward us with a figure who combines political daring, organizational skill, and moral rhetoric, these foundations would be forged into the first large-scale multi-ethnic empire the ancient world had seen. So the Persians moved from clan to kingdom not by accident, but by choice. Their choices were shaped by environment and by opportunity, but also by a clearer strategic vision to make power manageable, to turn mobile strength into recurring wealth, and to govern a diverse world through a mix of law, local autonomy, and centralized authority. Those choices set the stage for the decisive century to come, when a single ruler would take the fragile coalition of Persian clans and transmute it into an empire that commanded oceans of land and the loyalty of millions. In the next sweep of history that follows, these emergent institutions, the satrapies, the couriers, the marriage alliances, the tolerance of local custom, will be tested and enlarged. They will meet the polities of Lydia and Babylon. They will challenge great cities and create administrative systems that make true imperial scale possible. But every empire begins somewhere, and in the case of Persia, it began on those wind-swept plateaus, with people who knew how to move, bargain, and at the right moment, seize a horizon.
A single figure turns a ladder of small gains into a sweep of continents. His name echoes through ancient texts and modern debates. Cyrus II of Persia, later called Cyrus the Great. He did not invent empire, but he perfected a crucial recipe: swift, decisive military action, married to pragmatic governance and a moral rhetoric that made subjection feel, in many cases, like protection. What followed was not only the largest political union the Near East had seen to that point, but a template for ruling difference that would outlast his lifetime. Cyrus's rise begins with a family and a fissured region. Around 559 BCE, he inherited leadership of a relatively minor Persian principality centered at Pasargadae on the Iranian plateau. From that foothold, he launched a sequence of moves, political marriages, surprise strikes, and opportunistic alliances that first freed the Persians from Median overlordship and then rolled the new polity outward. The decisive break came against Astyages, king of the Medes. Ancient accounts dramatize the moment as a revolt led by a shrewd general and supported by disaffected Median nobles. The real mechanics probably combined battlefield success with elite defections and a convincing promise of continuity under new management. When Astyages fell, the Persians did not simply replace one tyranny with another. Cyrus absorbed Median administration, men, and institutions. He learned a lesson that would mark his reign: conquer, but co-opt. Cyrus's next moves demonstrate geopolitical acuity. He turned his attention westward to Lydia, a wealthy kingdom on the Aegean fringe ruled by Croesus. Lydia sat on crucial trade routes and controlled gold-bearing rivers. Its capture would provide both wealth and access to the Greek world. Around 547 BCE, in a conflict that reveals Cyrus's flexible use of force and diplomacy, Lydia collapsed. Ancient sources tell of a decisive cavalry action and a willingness by some Lydian satraps to switch allegiance. Cyrus's army, mobile and disciplined, could project power across varied terrains, plateau, plain, and river valley, making rapid conquest possible. The conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE is Cyrus's moment of symbolic and administrative mastery. Babylon was not merely another city, it was the cultural and economic heart of Mesopotamia, the heir to centuries of writing, law, and imperial tradition. Its walls had withstood sieges for generations. Yet Cyrus entered Babylon not like a vandal and conqueror, but as a claiming sovereign. He captured the city with relatively little destruction and immediately presented himself as a restorer of proper order. He portrayed Nabonidus, the last Neo-Babylonian king, as an illegitimate usurper who had neglected the gods and the priesthood. That rhetorical move was genius. By restoring temples, returning displaced cult statues, and repatriating peoples uprooted by prior conflicts, Cyrus framed his conquest as a moral correction. The clay cylinder discovered centuries later in Babylon, the so-called Cyrus cylinder, records many of these actions. Modern historians caution against reading it as a universal charter of human rights. It is, above all, a political text designed to legitimize Cyrus's rule in the eyes of Babylonians. Still, its content reflects a striking policy: rule through restoration and respect rather than wholesale suppression. One of Cyrus's most consequential acts was his handling of captive populations. The Hebrew Bible presents Cyrus as the liberator of the Jews, the king who allowed exiled Judeans to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. In Persian terms, this was consistent with his broader approach: allow local religious institutions to function, reinstate displaced elites when advantageous, and govern through local structures rather than through forced cultural assimilation. These acts earned Cyrus a reputation not just as a conqueror, but as a liberator in several subject communities, an image that traveled far beyond Persia and was inscribed into the memory of peoples across the region. But Cyrus's greatness was not merely in magnanimity. He was a strategist of logistics and organization. To hold territory required supply lines, garrisons, and loyal administrators. The Persians early on adopted the satrapal system, provincial governors who combined fiscal, military, and judicial duties. Under Cyrus, the satrapy began as a pragmatic device. Place trusted men in charge of new lands and let them manage tax collection and local order. The system's genius lay in its flexibility. Satraps could be Persians, Medes, or locally derived elites, depending on which choice best secured stability. This decentralization reduced the need for a constant, expensive occupying force, while allowing the crown to extract regular revenue. It created an empire where local continuity eased the friction of domination.
Communication and mobility were equally vital. Cyrus's forces were seasoned horsemen on a landscape that rewarded speed. They moved through mountains and across plains with an agility unmatched by many established city-states. But beyond military mobility, an imperial ruler needed reliable administrative communication, messengers, record-keeping, and a shared political vocabulary. Cyrus watched, learned, and adopted. The use of Aramaic as a common administrative tongue, the adaptation of local scribal traditions, and the employment of existing temple economies all contributed to a functioning imperial apparatus. Where other conquerors might have attempted cultural exclusion, Cyrus's method was integration. The ethics of Cyrus's rule also deserve scrutiny. His rhetoric, evoked later by Greek historians and the biblical tradition, emphasized justice, order, and the king's duty to preserve rather than obliterate. Whether Cyrus's personal convictions matched the rhetoric is impossible to verify. What matters is effect. Presenting conquest as restoration lowered resistance and brought practical benefits. Local priests and elites, reassured that their cults and privileges would continue, were more likely to cooperate. Merchants, seeing predictability in taxation and security on the roads, increased trade. In short, Cyrus created incentives for stakeholders across the empire to prefer the status quo under Persian rule to the uncertainty of rebellion. War and diplomacy under Cyrus were intertwined. He used marriage alliances as well as force. He negotiated with neighboring powers and exploited local rivalries. In his army, we see both professional core contingents and a capacity to integrate subject levies, a mixed force that could be scaled and deployed for different objectives. Even logistics, feeding and watering a mobile army on long campaigns, reveals an administrative mind at work. Building coalitions, co-opting elites, and maintaining supply lines were not separate arts. Together, they constituted the operational backbone of Cyrus's expansion. Cyrus's material legacy is visible in stone and in the plan of cities. He founded Pasargadae as a royal center, a modest but dignified capital, where the tomb he built for himself stands to this day. The tomb's simplicity tells us something about Cyrus's image, a king who wanted to be remembered for rulership and order more than for ostentation. His funerary monument, set within gardens and near palatial structures, became a place of pilgrimage for later Persian kings who traced their legitimacy to his line. Yet his death would remind the world that empire is a dangerous craft. According to classical accounts, Herodotus among them, Cyrus died on campaign against nomadic tribes in Central Asia, often identified as the Massagetae, around 530 BCE. Herodotus tells a dramatic tale, a battle in which Cyrus underestimated the enemy and was killed, and his body treated harshly by the Massagetae queen Tamaris. These tales, while likely colored by Greek narrative taste, point to a real fact. Persia's northern frontiers were perilous, and expansion carried mortal risk. Cyrus's death in battle cut short an energetic reign, but it did not end the empire he had forged. Instead, his successors inherited a structure, administrative habits, trade routes, satrapies, robust enough to survive a transition of power. Cyrus's personal style left another mark, a model for kingship that combined military prowess with administrative skill and moral rhetoric. Later Achaemenid monarchs, Cambyses, Darius, would learn both the promise and the pitfalls of his approach. Where Cyrus had often relied on negotiation and co-optation, some successors veered toward greater central control or harsher repression in moments of crisis. But the basic architecture of satrapies, of legal pluralism, of fiscal regularity, and long-distance communication traces back to Cyrus's innovations. The legacy of Cyrus also became a matter of memory politics. Greeks admired and vilified him in equal measure. Judeo-Christian tradition turned him into an instrument of divine will. Later Persian kings used his name to claim legitimacy. Archaeological finds, inscriptions, and classical texts together form a patchwork portrait. Cyrus as conqueror, liberator, administrator, and mythic founder. Modern historians sift these sources, aware that each carries bias: Greek moralizing, Babylonian administrative self-presentation, biblical theological aims. Yet when assembled, they suggest a ruler of rare practical intelligence. Finally, Cyrus's reign reframes the meaning of empire.
Empires do not rest solely on force. They rest on institutions that make force productive. Cyrus's genius was to convert sporadic victories into durable governance. By privileging restoration over annihilation, by co-opting elites instead of decapitating them, by building systems of revenue and rule instead of relying solely on booty, Cyrus transformed conquest into statecraft. He showed that an empire could be a network of obligations, services, and incentives, and that such a network could, if properly managed, hold together a world of many peoples.
If an empire is a body, then its arteries are the routes by which life flows. In the Achaemenid world, that life moved along carved stone, paved way stations, and the disciplined feet and hooves of couriers and messengers. What made Persia an empire was not only how far its borders reached, but how quickly and reliably a decision made in the palace could be felt in a distant province. This was an empire wired for administration, trade, and the movement of ideas. Imagine a map lit from within, a network of routes radiating from administrative hubs: Susa in the east, Persepolis in the heartland, Ecbatana in the northwest, Sardis toward the Aegean, each connected by well-maintained roads. The most famed of these arteries later became known to Greeks and Romans simply as the Royal Road. It did not appear overnight. It was the product of decades of investment, engineers, manpower, and a political will to make distance manageable. Where earlier states had ruled through concentric zones of influence, the Persians turned the act of ruling into a logistical problem, and then solved it. The function of roads goes beyond movement. A paved, secure route lowers the cost of travel and trade, increases the speed of information, and changes what rulers can demand. Where a hostile countryside once slowed armies and fragmentary tax collectors, a royal road produced predictability. Markets expanded because merchants could move goods with less risk. Craftsmen could specialize because raw materials were now reachable. And centers of production grew because reliable transport meant surplus could be exported. In the Achaemenid world, pottery motifs, administrative seals, and luxury goods circulated in ever wider circles. With them came ideas, legal formulas, artistic styles, and political vocabularies. To make those roads useful, the empire built supporting infrastructure that modern observers might call a communications grid. Way stations, spaced at regular intervals, offered fresh horses, provisions, and shelter. They were not mere inns. They were state-maintained nodes designed to accelerate official traffic. Royal messengers could hand off a sealed dispatch at one station and find a fresh mount at the next, shaving days, even weeks off travel time. The system was not casual. It was disciplined and standardized. Couriers were organized, fed, and protected. The Persian administration understood that speed of information could be the difference between a province slipping into revolt and a rebellion being nipped in the bud. The messengers themselves became legendary in later storytelling because their system was both efficient and psychologically powerful. They carried not just letters, but authority, the crown's presence condensed in ink and seal. When a satrap received a sealed order, rebellion became a riskier bet. When a merchant carried a tax receipt stamped by a central official, creditors and buyers recognized predictability. The act of signing, sealing, and delivering was, in effect, a ritual that bound distant nodes of empire into a single political organism. To ensure uniformity across this organism, the Persians adopted common administrative practices. One crucial innovation was the use of Aramaic as a lingua franca for administration. Aramaic scribes produced records, tax lists, and official correspondence that could be read by officials across a mosaic of tongues. This was a pragmatic choice, not cultural erasure. Local languages continued for worship and custom, but Aramaic allowed a pragmatic cohesion. When a decree traveled from capital to satrapy, the medium mattered. A shared administrative language reduced misunderstandings and transaction costs. The satrapal system worked hand in glove with the communication network. Satraps, provincial governors, acted as semi-autonomous nodes with responsibility for collecting tribute, maintaining order, and overseeing local military forces. With efficient roads and regular couriers, the central authority could supervise those satraps without micromanaging daily life across the empire. Inspectors and royal emissaries could travel to audit accounts. Taxes could be remitted in cash or kind and recorded. Military orders could be relayed and reinforcements summoned. In short, communication made decentralized governance possible. The empire could be both vast and administratively tight. Infrastructure extended beyond roads and stations. Persian engineers and administrators used technology and landscape management to secure resources and stabilize economic life. Qanats, underground galleries tapping groundwater and channeling it to the surface, were one of the region's transformative hydraulic technologies. By lowering water loss through evaporation, qanats made arid lands agriculturally productive and supported urbanization in regions that otherwise would be marginal. These subterranean aqueducts required coordinated labor and maintenance, and their presence points to an administrative capacity to organize long-term public works. Urban centers, supplied by consistent irrigation, could support bureaucracies, garrisons, and craftsmen, again knitting the territorial fabric tighter. Ports and canals mattered too. Control over the coastline and the effective use of rivers increased the empire's capacity for trade. In Mesopotamia, canals that extended irrigation and allowed transport increased agricultural surplus and multiplied taxable output. Susa and Babylon were economic engines whose productivity the central authority harnessed. When the state could count on regular harvests, it could calculate obligations. Predictable yields made taxation feasible without crushing local economies.
Money, in turn, flowed along the same channels. While the full standardization of coinage would reach its apogee under later rulers, the circulation of bullion and endowment gifts across the empire set the stage for more sophisticated fiscal instruments. Markets responded to security and dependability. When roads and law reduced risk, merchants expanded credit networks. The ability to move wealth quickly and to measure obligations precisely allowed the empire to finance bigger armies and invest in grand construction projects that symbolized power. But connectivity is not only economic and administrative, it is cultural. The movement of artisans, priestly traditions, and artistic motifs reconfigured local identities. Persepolis's stone reliefs, for instance, show delegations bringing tribute from distant lands, a ceremonial visualization of the network. The objects traded along the roads, textiles, metalwork, incense, exotic animals, carried with them visual languages. Craftsmen adopted foreign methods. Religious cults borrowed imagery. Scribal repertoires diffused. Over generations, this cross-pollination created a distinctive cosmopolitanism in cities where peoples of many tongues lived under a single political order. Communication also shaped legal practice. The Persian state allowed local law and custom to persist, yet through channels of communication, it could also promulgate overriding norms. Royal decrees, preserved in inscriptions and administrative texts, set fiscal expectations and defined the rules of engagement between center and periphery. The crown's proclamations could be replicated, read aloud, and displayed, a ritual of public knowledge that helped standardize governance across cultural differences. In many ways, the empire behaved like a federation of jurisdictions linked not by ethnic uniformity, but by shared political instruments. Military logistics were an aspect of this system that bore constant attention. An army needs roads, forage, and predictable supply. The Persian approach was to combine strategic garrisons with the ability to move the core fighting force across long distances. During campaigns, the same road network that carried tribute and merchants carried baggage trains, siege engines, and reinforcements. The army's capacity to operate at a distance depended on the very infrastructure that supported trade and administration, turning civilian investments into military advantages. We should not romanticize this system. It was built to extract and control as much as to connect. Tribute and taxation created obligations that could be heavy, and the maintenance of roads and stations required labor. The imperial presence could be intrusive, yet the Persians understood a central paradox of empires. The more you can make domination look like order and service, the less you must rely solely on force. Provide safe roads, quick justice, and predictable markets, and many subject peoples will prefer an imperial order that secures their commerce and temples over the uncertain turbulence of local warlords. The courier system also had an unforeseen intellectual effect. As officials, merchants, and travelers traversed the empire, they carried not just goods, but stories and ideas. Philosophical and religious exchanges were incremental but profound. Zoroastrian concepts of order and truth moved through priestly networks. Mesopotamian legal thought informed administrative practices. Greek traders introduced new philosophical questions along the periphery. Over decades, these exchanges produced a shared vocabulary for governance and ethics that crossed cultural boundaries. A Persian official in Susa could discuss accounts with a Babylonian scribe and receive not only numbers, but a shared sense of administrative practice. Finally, this network had symbolic power. The image of a ruler whose word could be sent across thousands of miles and acted upon reinforced the idea of a single political center. Royal inscriptions, monumental architecture, and organized processions were not mere pageantry. They were performative acts that made the invisible network visible. The empire shone as a coordinated, purposeful organism. When envoys arrived with the king's seal, they carried legitimacy that could be recognized in temple precincts and market squares alike. When we step back, the Persian system, roads, couriers, satrapies, hydraulic works, standardized administrative practices, reveals a singular ambition to make empire governably scalable. Where earlier polities had depended on personal loyalties and local ties, the Achaemenids built institutions that could outlast individuals. They made distance less deadly to authority. In doing so, they changed the practical possibilities of rule. Kings could now imagine a realm that spanned continents, not just valleys. Administrators could count on networks to move wealth and men. Artisans could find widely dispersed markets, and ideas could cross once impassable frontiers. This was not merely engineering, it was statecraft, the slow, deliberate creation of systems that turned conquest into administration and administration into longevity. The roads and couriers of Persia did more than connect points on a map. They connected people, economies, and cultures. They made it possible for an ancient world of city-states and tribes to become something new, a single political order in which distance no longer guaranteed autonomy, and in which shared infrastructures stitched diverse lives into the reality of empire.
When power breaks, two things can follow: unraveling and the effort to stitch a new pattern. Into the rupture left by Cyrus and his immediate successors stepped a ruler unlike many before him, energetic, bureaucratic, and implacably determined to convert an empire's raw force into durable order. His name was Darius, often called Darius I or Darius the Great. If Cyrus was the architect who sketched the empire's outline, Darius was the administrator who drew the blueprint and handed it to a generation of civil servants to execute. The story begins in turmoil. The transition after Cyrus was brittle. The throne changed hands, and in the chaos, a usurper, known in Greek sources as the Magian Gaumata, claimed kingship. The empire teetered on the brink of fragmentation as regional governors tested the center's authority. Into that danger stepped Darius, a prince of the Achaemenid house who claimed both royal blood and the mandate to restore order. His response was not merely military, it was performative statecraft. To legitimize his reign, he needed more than victory. He needed a story that could be read by officials across a polyglot realm. That story would be carved, literally and permanently, into living rock. The Behistun inscription is Darius's political manifesto made manifest. Cut high into a cliff face in the mountains of modern-day Iran, its carved lines tell how he defeated pretenders and rebels, naming defeated kings and satraps, and allocating blame. It is, in many ways, an imperial constitution, a public record in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, asserting who he was and why his rule should be accepted. The inscription did practical work. It declared victories, enumerated punishments, and demonstrated that the center could not only punish, but also record and explain. In an empire where legitimacy depended on recognition from many quarters, such a public text was as powerful as an army. Darius moved quickly from rhetoric to reform. The core of his achievement was administrative clarity. The satrapy system, provincial governance through satraps, already existed in embryonic form, but Darius reorganized it into a more systematic architecture. Provinces were rationalized, fiscal responsibilities were clarified, channels of accountability strengthened. Rather than rely solely on personal loyalty, he built offices and procedures. A layer of inspectors, known as the king's eyes and ears, monitored satraps. Standardized tribute assessments replaced ad hoc plunder, and record-keeping became professionalized. These measures reduced the unpredictability that had made provinces restless. One of Darius's great innovations was financial standardization. Money matters when you govern at scale. The Lydian invention of coinage had already revolutionized commerce, but Darius refined that revolution. Under his rule, the gold daric and the silver sigloi circulated widely, not only as currency, but as a symbol of imperial unity. Standard coinage allowed tribute to be calculated and remitted in a consistent medium. It allowed markets to expand because buyers and sellers shared a common unit of value. It allowed the state to pay soldiers and bureaucrats reliably. Where earlier empires had relied on irregular levies and booty, Darius built predictable sources of revenue: regular tribute, taxes assessed by province, and a treasurer's apparatus that could account for receipts. Economic reform went beyond money. Darius reorganized lands, encouraged agriculture through investment in irrigation, and invested in infrastructure that had both commercial and military uses. He reportedly commissioned canals connecting seas and rivers, improved roads, including enhancing the famous Royal Road, and endowed urban centers with granaries and warehouses. These were not merely grand gestures, they were intentional projects that translated imperial ambition into daily benefits for merchants, farmers, and soldiers alike. Infrastructure made the empire governable. It made the crown's presence visible in quotidian life. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart that would later symbolize Achaemenid grandeur, took shape under Darius's patronage. The terraces, the audience halls, and the monumental stairways, these were not only artistic statements, but administrative theaters. Delegations from subject lands arrived, presented tribute, and were recorded in reliefs that both documented and ritualized imperial order. Architecture became policy.
The palace complex embodied the hierarchy it administered. When foreign delegations walked up those stairs, their procession rehearsed the political grammar of a world bound to a central monarchy.
Darius's reforms extended into law and record. He tightened the royal archive, standardized weights and measures, and promoted Aramaic as an administrative lingua franca where expediency required it. Bureaucracy needed language to operate. A common medium allowed accounts, decrees, and judicial decisions to travel intelligibly across borders. Legal clarity reduced disputes and made the enforcement of imperial norms more straightforward. The crown's writ could now be read, interpreted, and executed with fewer local confusions, a small thing that made governance far more effective. Military policy, too, was reshaped. Darius understood that the empire's weakness lay not only in distant governors, but in overstretched armies. He reorganized recruitment and garrisoning practices. Satraps were responsible for local levies, but the crown maintained elite units and a mobile reserve that could be dispatched across the Royal Road network. His campaigns expanded the empire's reach into the Indus Valley, into Thrace, and against rebellious regions, but he also institutionalized defense. Frontier fortifications, garrison towns, and logistical plans for provisioning distant forces became part of the new playbook. In short, Darius fused military power to bureaucratic predictability. His expansionist streak brought Persia into repeated contact and conflict with the Greek world to the west. The story of Darius and the Greeks is a tale of miscalculation, pride, and the limits of imperial reach. In supporting Ionian Greek city-states against their own Greek mainland overlords, Darius faced a contagion of revolt. When Ionian cities rebelled, they invited Athenian sympathy and involvement. Rather than treating Greek city-states as mere tributary zones, the dynamics of Greek political culture, independent polis with traditions of civic assembly and military mobilization, produced resistance that the Persian administrative paradigm struggled to assimilate. The famous first Persian expedition to Greece, mounted under Darius, ended with a sobering military reversal at Marathon in 490 BCE. The image of Persian forces disembarking on foreign beaches only to be repelled by Athenian hoplites carries enormous symbolic weight. Strategically, Marathon demonstrated how terrain, tactics, and local cohesion could blunt imperial weight. Politically, it reminded the Achaemenid court that some parts of the Mediterranean world would not bend easily to distant rule. The loss forced Darius to reconsider the limits of coercion. It taught the empire that not everywhere would administrative finesse suffice. Some regions required a different calculus. Yet Darius remained a relentless builder. His inscriptions, apart from Behistun, appear across the empire, in Egypt, Babylonia, and Anatolia. He adopted a policy of religious and cultural tolerance, not as abstract philanthropy, but as realpolitik. In Egypt, he portrayed himself as a liberator who restored temples and rites neglected under previous rulers. In Babylon, he presented himself as a restorer of proper order. This policy lowered the political cost of conquest. If local religious and legal customs could survive under Persian overlordship, then elites had less incentive to revolt. Tribute and law could be extracted without destroying the social fabrics that produced taxable surplus. Darius's reign was not flawless. Centralization brought its own dangers. Rigid procedures could become an obstacle when speed and improvisation mattered. Fiscal demands risked overburdening regions already strained by war or drought. Court intrigues and succession anxieties persisted. The king's inspectors, the king's eyes and ears, sometimes bred resentment, and satraps continued to test the boundaries of loyalty. Even well-run systems are susceptible to the human variables of greed, ambition, and local grievance. Still, the durability of Darius's reforms is what marks his greatness. By the time of his death around 486 BCE, he had left behind an empire that functioned more like a state than a coalition of tribes. His combination of fiscal discipline, road improvements, coinage, and the satrapal network created conditions under which a powerful monarchy could endure. The Achaemenid machine had evolved from a conquest force into a governing apparatus that could collect revenue predictably, move forces effectively, and administer justice across cultural difference. There is moral complexity in Darius's legacy. He centralized power and used it for expansion. His roads made movement easier for officials and armies alike. His sarcophagi and palaces testified to monumental wealth accumulated through systems of extraction. Yet the administrative coherence he created also produced relative peace, flourishing trade, and a circulation of ideas that enriched the ancient world. Markets expanded, cities specialized, and the raw materials of civilization, metals, cloth, and grain, flowed with more regularity. For many subject peoples, the Persian order was preferable to chronic local war. In the end, Darius's achievement was to show that empire is not merely conquest followed by intermittent rule. It is the slow, daily work of making authority legible, payable, and enforceable. He turned improvised domination into an apparatus of roads, inspectors, coin, and archive that made the Achaemenid state legible to its subjects. Where Cyrus had opened possibilities with daring, Darius disciplined those possibilities into policy.
Empires have horizons. They expand until they meet a limit that is not merely geographic, but cultural and political. For the Achaemenids, that horizon lay to the west, a sunlit, fractious coastline of city-states, islands, and merchant ports that spoke, argued, and fought in ways the Persian court found at once baffling and irresistible. The clash that followed was not simply a sequence of battles. It was the collision of two political imaginaries, the Persian dream of ordered, integrated sovereignty, and the Greek passion for civic autonomy and face-to-face politics. The spark came from the Aegean's eastern littoral, the Ionian cities on the coast of Anatolia. They were Greek in language and culture, but geographically they lay at the edge of the Achaemenid sphere. Under Persian rule, these cities lived in an uneasy accommodation. Local elites could keep their customs, temples, and magistrates, but they paid tribute and accepted Persian oversight. For years, this arrangement functioned as the Persians intended, efficient, extractive, and relatively peaceful. But the Greek habit of independence had its contagions. In 499 BCE, frustrated by heavy-handed satrapal administration and inspired by both local grievances and the prospect of aid, the Ionian cities rose in revolt. They appealed to mainland Greeks for help, and Athens and Eretria answered with ships, men, and moral encouragement. The rebellion was at once a local tax revolt and a broader political statement. The Greek city-state, when stirred, would not accept vassalage easily. From the Persian perspective, this was intolerable. It signaled that the western fringe could become a persistent source of instability, sparking unrest elsewhere and threatening the smooth flow of tribute and grain. For Persia, revolt demanded a response not merely to reassert control, but to demonstrate the logic of empire. When the center speaks, the periphery must listen. Darius saw the Ionian revolt as both an affront and an opportunity. The campaign that followed would intertwine punitive force, diplomatic calculation, and a demonstration of imperial resolve intended to dissuade other provinces from similar experiments in independence. The Ionian rebellion was suppressed by about 493 BCE, but its reverberations echoed to the Greek mainland. When Athens had sent ships to help Miletus and other Ionian cities, it had not intended a permanent war with Persia, yet the Persians could not ignore the political symbolism. Darius, a ruler attuned to both spectacle and logistics, resolved to make an example. He issued orders that would culminate in invasions aimed at punishing those who aided the revolt and at bringing the Greek world into clearer submission to Persian will. Persia's military approach to the West combined what had served it so well across Asia: vast resources, multi-ethnic forces, naval contingents recruited from subject peoples, and a strategic patience that could turn a punitive raid into a wider campaign. Yet the Greeks presented unique challenges. Their strength lay in local cohesion, citizen soldiery, and tactical innovations like the hoplite phalanx, heavily armored infantry who fought in disciplined, overlapping ranks. The Persian army, formidable on wide plains and in multi-front warfare, was less optimized for the tight, infantry-centric battles favored on Greek soil. Moreover, the Greek polis had a social structure that produced committed, often fanatical defenders. Citizens fought for land, law, and reputation, the tangible, touchable things that bind political communities together. The first expression of this collision came at Marathon in 490 BCE. Persia sent a fleet and a force under generals from the empire to punish Athens and Eretria, to make clear that aiding rebels would bring ruin. The Persians landed on the Attic plain at Marathon, a place with a shallow bay and open ground, tempting an imperial army used to maneuver and cavalry. The Athenians, facing the prospect of a numerically superior foe, made an unusual strategic choice. Under Miltiades and other leaders, they moved to confront the Persians on the field rather than cower behind walls. Their decision reflected Greek politics. A city that could not defend its territory risked losing its political identity. For Athens, there was no acceptable alternative to meeting the threat head-on.
What happened at Marathon was as much tactical as symbolic. The Athenians arrayed their hoplites in a phalanx that emphasized cohesion over brute numbers. They advanced faster than contemporary battle doctrine suggested, a controlled sprint across the plain that closed the distance before Persian archers could decimate them. The hoplites' heavy shields interlocked, their spears bristled. The Persian force, heavy with light-armed troops and cavalry used to looser fight, found its compact formations ill-suited to withstanding the disciplined shock of hoplite impact. Herodotus records a Greek victory that was decisive, a psychological blow that showed that a well-led citizen army could repel imperial weight. Marathon's real significance was not only military but political. It demonstrated that the empire's projection of force could be checked in the West, and it revealed a weakness in the Persian governance calculus. Coercion alone could not guarantee compliance where civic identity and military pragmatism were determined to resist. For the Athenians, Marathon became a foundational story, proof that collective courage and local political solidarity could hold back a titled monarchy. For the Persians, it was a lesson in the limits of reach and in the stubbornness of cultural difference. Darius did not live to see any beyond the first forays stretch his will. His death shifted the mantle of imperial response to his successor. But the Persian dream of the West was not abandoned. The Ionian Revolt and Marathon hardened Persia's view of the Greeks as a peculiar but critical frontier, one that required more than occasional punitive raids if the Achaemenid objective of secure, profitable borders was to be sustained. Yet this collision was not one-sided. Persian administrators remained convinced that inclusion and accommodation could still work where blunt force failed. They watched Greek politics and tried alternative strategies, building client relationships, using diplomacy, and installing friendly oligarchies where possible. The empire's resources made these strategies feasible: gold, ships, satrapal leverage. The Spartans, Athenians, and Corinthians had their own internal divisions. Persia sought to exploit these when possible, preferring to break Greek coalitions rather than destroy each polis outright. The imperial playbook thus expanded, from roads and courts to bribery, political patronage, and the funding of favorable parties within the polis. This interplay sharpened a philosophical contrast that would reverberate for centuries. On one side stood an imperial logic that prized order, predictability, and the extension of a single sovereign's authority across diversity. The Persian state saw unanimity under a crown as an ennobling project, a way to secure trade, protect temples, and reduce the cost of repeated wars. On the other side stood the Greek ethic of civic autonomy,
the belief that political legitimacy springs from the active participation of citizens in lawmaking, in arms, and in the shared life of the polis. These were not merely different systems of government, they were different answers to what it meant to be a political human being. The Persians valued administrative cohesion, the Greeks prized the face-to-face deliberations and reputational stakes that defined community. This tension produced both tragedy and creative tension. Where Persia could impose order, Greek culture produced philosophy, drama, and a civic rhetoric that celebrated debate and dissent. Confrontation thus became a crucible in which both sides learned and borrowed. Persian courts absorbed Hellenic mercenaries, Greek thinkers engaged with Near Eastern ideas, and the very image of monarchy was reinterpreted through contact. Culture followed contact. Art, coinage, and even religious ideas diffused across borders. Yet when politics demanded, both systems could produce ruthless measures, the Persians by mobilizing imperial might, the Greeks by punishing cities that betrayed collectives or hosting internecine slaughter. The western frontier also exposed operational limits to the Persian imperial model. The logistics of projecting power across the Aegean, across sea lanes and among fiercely autonomous islands, meant that naval capability, not just land forces, became decisive. Sea power required different command frameworks and a greater tolerance for the unpredictability of weather and local alliances. The Persians, who relied heavily on subject fleets and coastal levies, discovered that maritime campaigns demanded a different kind of political patience and resource allocation than the roads of the inland empire. When Persia returned with greater force under later kings, the memory of Marathon sharpened both sides. For the Greeks, it became a moral anchor. For the Persians, it became a problem to solve. The imperial dream of the West did not die at Marathon, it shifted. Persia adapted its strategies, amplified its resources, and contemplated larger campaigns. However, cultural friction and the political volatility of the Greek world meant that achieving stable hegemony there would be more difficult and more expensive than the Achaemenid court had imagined. In the end, the Persian engagements in the West reveal a central paradox of imperial ambition. To extend authority is to confront difference, different loyalties, languages, and ideas. Where inclusion could be engineered through administrative acumen, it often succeeded. Where civic identity was compact and militarily robust, inclusion required either disproportionate force or a recalibration of imperial aims. The Ionian Revolt and the clash at Marathon thus stand as early tests of how far an empire could carry its model before the model itself needed changing. This chapter in Persian history is not simply a prelude to later catastrophes. It is a critical moment where the limits of administrative genius met the stubborn, intimate politics of the polis. It is where the Persian dream of orderly dominion encountered the messy, sacred urgency of Greek civic life, and where both sides began to realize that the future of the Mediterranean would be written not by one polity alone, but by their interaction, trade and war, philosophy and propaganda, alliance and enmity. The Achaemenid court learned that the West must be engaged with both force and finesse. The Greeks learned they could repel empire, at least for a while, by binding themselves together in moments of extreme danger.
When an empire feels invincible, it often reaches for symbols that make its power visible to the world. Xerxes I, grandson of Darius the Great, dreamed in such symbols. He inherited an empire larger and more organized than any his predecessors had known, and he conceived an invasion of Greece not simply as a military campaign, but as a statement. Persia would punish defiance, secure the western frontier, and bring the Aegean under its imperial order. What he set in motion was magnificent in ambition and fatal in consequence. An overreach where engineering triumphs and logistical genius collided with political miscalculation, fierce local resistance, and the slow unraveling of imperial coherence. The decision to invade in force was informed by more than vengeance for Marathon. Xerxes saw strategic logic: subdue the Greek city-states that had defied Persian authority, secure sea lanes and tribute flows, and eliminate a persistent source of instability on the empire's western flank. But the scale he chose to deploy, an enormous land army, a flotilla to dominate the sea, and the political theater to match, made the campaign as much about spectacle as about strategy. To cross from Asia into Europe, he ordered an engineering feat that would itself become legend: the bridge across the Hellespont. The Hellespont Bridge was both practical and theatrical. Xerxes' engineers lashed together ships to form a floating causeway spanning the narrow strait between Asia Minor and Thrace. The image persists: tens of thousands of troops marching across roofs of wood and rope, the king's column unrolling onto European soil. And it was intended to signal that no natural barrier could impede Persian will. The bridge was an act of imperial hearth and hammer: move the army, move the supply trains, and declare ownership of the passage. Yet even as it embodied Persian organizational capacity, it also exposed vulnerability. The crossing required careful maintenance, security, and immense provisioning. A bridge spanning water is not only a path for soldiers, it is a rolling target for weather, sabotage, and the frictions of logistics. Once ashore, the Persian force, a multi-ethnic aggregation drawn from the empire's enormous diversity, fanned out across Thessaly and into central Greece. Ancient writers speak of enormous numbers. Modern scholarship is cautious, but the operational reality was clear. Xerxes controlled enough men and ships to mount simultaneous operations across large swaths of territory. The Persian army excelled at mobility, at integrating cavalry and light infantry, and at using subject peoples' contributions to create a multi-pronged threat. But Greece offered something different from the plains of Asia: narrow passes, fortified cities, and a political landscape of fiercely independent communities whose stubborn loyalty to local institutions made wholesale submission costly. The first great test of Xerxes' plan came at Thermopylae, a narrow coastal pass where the mountains crowd close to the sea. Thermopylae offered a rare geographic choke point through which a numerically inferior force could resist a far larger invader. The Greeks, a small coalition of city-states led by Sparta's king Leonidas, with troops from many polities, chose to hold the pass. Their strategy was not to defeat Persia in a single pitched battle, but to deny it easy passage, to buy time for Greek navies to marshal and for defensive networks to solidify. In this sense, Thermopylae was a sacrifice intended to slow the imperial tide. What transpired there turned into the most enduring of ancient images: a resolute stand in narrow geography, brave resistance against flood. The Greek phalanx, with its overlapping shields and disciplined cohesion, fought in a way that neutralized the numerical advantages of the Persian host. For days, the Spartans and their allies repulsed frontal assaults, inflicting disproportionate casualties. Yet the tactical stalemate was broken when the Persians, aided by a local guide, outflanked the defenders by climbing a shepherd's path and attacking from the rear. The decision by Leonidas to remain with a small rear guard, including the famous 300 Spartans, turned the pass into a tableau of martyrdom. Thermopylae's fall opened the heartland of Greece to the invader, but its moral effect was opposite to what Xerxes intended. The stand galvanized Greek resistance and crystallized a narrative of shared sacrifice. With mountains behind them and the interior exposed, Xerxes turned his attention to naval control, a necessity if he was to supply and shelter his army from seaborne interference. The Persian fleet, gathered from across the empire's maritime subjects, moved to secure the Greek littoral. The Athenian strategy, however, redeployed the logic of limited geography. They understood that the sea, narrow channels, and an intimate knowledge of local waters could negate a larger fleet's advantages. Themistocles, Athens' strategic mind, lured the Persian navy into the straits near Salamis, a confined arena where maneuvering large numbers of ships was difficult and where the disciplined Greek triremes, built for speed and ramming in tight quarters, could work their advantage.
The Battle of Salamis was decisive in form, if not immediately in numbers. Under a sky of tension, Greek ships struck with coordinated aggression. The cramped waters multiplied confusion in the Persian ranks and undermined their ability to coordinate a multi-ethnic armada. Many Persian ships were lost or disabled, others retreated in disorder. Xerxes watched from his vantage point on the shore and witnessed the collapse of his naval initiative. Without naval dominance, his supply lines and the security of his army on foreign soil were imperiled. Logistics in war is a language of dependency. Food, winter quarters, reinforcements, and Salamis cut Persia's sea lifeline. The defeat at Salamis prompted a decisive imperial choice. Xerxes chose to withdraw a significant portion of his land force back across the Hellespont, taking with him spoils, dependent troops, and the royal household. He left behind a rump army under Mardonius to continue operations in Greece. To contemporaries, this was a grim admission that the campaign had not gone to plan. The king who had once crossed the sea on a bridge now retreated with a reduced force, and in doing so, he exposed the deeper brittleness of imperial reach. Leaving Mardonius behind was in retrospect a strategic miscalculation. The remaining Persian contingent, deprived of the king's immediate presence and the full complement of imperial resources, faced renewed Greek resistance. The decisive land battle then occurred at Plataea in 479 BCE. Here, Greek hoplites again used disciplined infantry tactics to face and rout Persian forces in terrain favorable to the Greeks. At Mycale, an accompanying naval engagement on the Anatolian coast, Greek forces struck Persian naval holdings and further weakened the empire's capacity to sustain control in the Aegean. The twin defeats at Plataea and Mycale marked a turning point. Persia's western campaign had failed to secure lasting domination and had cost prestige, men, and, crucially, political momentum.
What did these defeats reveal about the Achaemenid system? First, the campaign exposed the limits of projecting a multi-ethnic imperial force into a polity defined by small-scale, intense civic loyalty. Persian administrative smoothing and local accommodation that worked so well in Egypt, Babylon, or Anatolia could not easily accommodate the particularities of Greek political life. The Greek polis fought for identity and possession. Their resistance was not simply military, but civic and existential. Second, the logistics of maintaining an army across the sea, in territory where local naval power could contest supply lines, were horrendously demanding. Persia's roads and couriers had been the empire's backbone in the interior. In the Aegean, the sea was a realm where local knowledge and naval practice could overturn raw imperial numbers. Third, the campaign strained center-periphery relations. The mobilization required ships, troops, and tributes from many subject peoples. While some contingents fought loyally, others were less committed, fighting for pay rather than passion. The dependence on subject levies and their reliability in extended campaigns became an operational headache. When armies are a mosaic of loyalties, cohesion under stress is never guaranteed. Xerxes' withdrawal signaled to satraps and provincial elites that imperial guarantees could be fallible. That perception can breed both subtle realignments and overt opportunism. Psychology matters in imperial politics. Xerxes' hubristic gestures had been intended to awe and pacify. Instead, they provoked a coalition of city-states that found moral coherence in resistance. Thermopylae became a mythic touchstone. Salamis, a proof that coordinated sea power could shatter an armada. Plataea, a moment when combined Greek arms delivered strategic closure. For Persia, the consequences were not immediate collapse, but an erosion of momentum and a diminution of unquestioned dominance. The empire endured, but the aura of invincibility evaporated. Culturally, the encounters produced complex legacies. Greek historians would tell the story as a victory of freedom over despotism, a narrative that shaped Western political imagination for millennia. Persia, meanwhile, continued to rule a vast and diverse domain, and would integrate Greek mercenaries, adopt Hellenic artistic forms in some locales, and persist as a major power. Xerxes' retreat did not end Persian influence, it transformed it. The empire learned to manage the Greek frontier more cautiously, and later Achaemenid kings invested in diplomacy, client states, and selective shows of force rather than outright occupation. There is also the personal dimension. Xerxes returned to his palace with spoils, but also with the knowledge that his gamble had failed to achieve its grand design. Historians note the psychological weight of such reversals on monarchs whose legitimacy is partly performative. A king's reputation is an asset. Defeat diminishes it. In the court, questions of loyalty and succession that had always simmered now found new fuel. The Persian court would never be the same in tone after Xerxes. The campaign's reverberations influenced the empire's internal politics, its cultural self-understanding, and even how later generations of Persian rulers wrote their annals. From the standpoint of long-term history, Xerxes' invasion marks a pivot. The Achaemenid model of rule, administrative sophistication, roads, satraps, and tolerant pragmatism proved robust within contiguous territories. But when projected across the sea into a region where political energies ran in very different directions, the model's constraints became visible. The empire's center had invested in infrastructure and administrative norms that worked best where distance could be neutralized through roads, messages, and appointed governors. The sea and the civic spirit of the Greek polis required a different political grammar. Still, the empire survived. It rebuilt, reasserted control where it could, and continued to be a major cultural and political force. But Xerxes' failed attempt to force the West into permanent submission changed the terms of imperial self-confidence. The dream of a Mediterranean under Persian order had been tested and found wanting. In its place came a new equilibrium, occasional confrontation, strategic diplomacy, and a grudging accommodation to a Greek world increasingly self-confident and interconnected. Cinematically, this chapter is a study in contrasts. The spectacle of a bridge across the Hellespont and the quiet terror of a narrow pass, massive fleets arrayed under king's colors, and the intimate violence of trireme clashes in constricted straits, triumphant entry and humbled withdrawal. Xerxes' campaign embodies the peril of hubris when political ambition exceeds the operational realities of geography, logistics, and cultural difference. It teaches a harsh lesson. Engineering grandeur can carry an empire only so far, after which the human limits of loyalty, terrain, and tactical innovation will reassert themselves with decisive force. As the Achaemenid world regrouped, the empire's internal stresses, fiscal strain, satrapal autonomy, court politics, would matter more. The Western expedition had not destroyed Persia, but it had introduced a turning tide, from expansion at all costs to a more defensive, adaptive posture. In that shift, the seeds of later vulnerability were planted, seeds that would be harvested years hence by a new conqueror from beyond Persia's eastern frontiers.
After the thunder of Xerxes' campaign, the Achaemenid Empire did not implode in a single dramatic moment. It continued to rule vast tracts of land, to collect tribute, and to erect palaces whose reliefs still spoke of order and ritual. Yet beneath that outward continuity, a quieter process took hold, a slow loosening of the bonds that had once knitted center to periphery. This is the history of attrition, the small failures, the political leaks, the fiscal pressures, and the cultural stresses that, accumulated over decades, make an empire more brittle than its monuments would suggest. The first symptom was administrative drift. Darius had built a machine, satraps answerable to a central treasury, inspectors to patrol loyalties, a lingua franca for records. Over generations, however, institutions ossify or are hollowed out by human behavior. The process was incremental. Satraps who once acted as delegated agents began to act like semi-independent rulers. The logistics that bound them to the center, Auditors, couriers, and periodic inspections were costly to maintain. Fiscal strain, local wealth, and the temptations of power produced a familiar dynamic. A provincial governor who could keep his coffers full by skimming tribute or by striking local alliances often had little immediate incentive to submit fully to an emperor many days' ride distant. Court politics accelerated this centrifugal tendency. After great kings die, succession rarely proceeds without contest. The Persian court, with its palaces, eunuchs, royal household, and competing noble houses, was a place where ambition and grievance could crystallize into rebellion. Assassination, palace intrigue, and contested successions created moments of uncertainty that provincial actors could exploit. Even a single ambiguous succession or a long regency could embolden a satrap to withhold revenue, recruit more troops, or negotiate with rival powers. Over time, these episodic crises became patterned occasions for decentralization. Economic pressure deepened the problem. Empires must fund armies, palaces, and public works. They must also absorb shocks like bad harvests, drought, and commodity price shifts. The Persian fiscal system was sophisticated, but it was not immune to strain. Large military campaigns, like Xerxes' Western venture, left the treasury lighter. Maintaining garrisons across the empire required steady resources. When tribute fell short, or when the state demanded higher levies, local resentment rose. Heavy-handed collection could push subject peoples from grudging compliance to active resistance. Likewise, as trade routes shifted or markets reoriented through war, piracy, or changing demand, the predictable flows on which the imperial budget depended could falter. Military change compounded the political and economic stresses. The empire had long relied on a mixture of imperial contingents and subject levies, but in the decades after Xerxes, the Persian military increasingly relied on hired troops and mercenary contingents to supplement its forces. Greek hoplites, Thracian peltasts, and other professional soldiers moved across the region in greater numbers. Mercenaries offered immediate tactical advantages, but they also brought costs. They were expensive, often more loyal to paymasters than to abstract authority, and sometimes independent actors in political contests. The presence of professional soldiers who could be hired or bought became a force multiplier for ambitious satraps and challengers inside the court. Cultural and social stresses also mattered. The Achaemenid Empire's strength was its pluralism, its willingness to accommodate different religions, laws, and customs under one fiscal umbrella. That same pluralism, however, made it harder to cultivate a single unifying ideology that could survive long periods of uncertainty. Local identities, Egyptian priesthoods, Babylonian administrative classes, Phrygian aristocrats retained deep roots that occasionally resurfaced as platforms for revolt. The crown's legitimacy relied in part on ritual recognition from local elites. When those elites were bought off, oppressed, or alienated, the symbolic basis for overlordship thinned. Where once the king's name on a tablet meant law and order, over time the same inscription could be read as the record of an external tax, and that reading could provoke resistance. Regional revolts became more frequent and more dangerous. Egypt, for example, was never part of Persia by cultural affinity. It accepted Persian sovereignty when local rulers saw benefit or coercion. But Egypt's agricultural wealth and unique religious institutions made it both valuable and volatile. Recurrent revolts in the Nile Valley consumed resources and attention and forced the center to expend military energy in a part of the empire that was logistically distant. In Anatolia, powerful satraps sometimes carved quasi-hereditary domains. In the eastern provinces, local dynasts adapted Persian administrative forms to their own ends.
the empire's patchwork of integration loosened into a mosaic of semi-autonomous centers. Communication, the very system that once made the empire governable, frayed at the edges. The Royal Road and its couriers remained impressive, but the costs of tight surveillance across 3 continents were high. The king's eyes and ears could not be everywhere at once. Inspections were episodic, and a satrap with the will and the means could buy time or elude scrutiny. Slower response times meant rebellions festering longer before suppression. The farther a province sat from the palaces, the more likely it was to act opportunistically in moments of imperial distraction. Ideological reactions followed. Where earlier rulers had used rhetoric of justice and restoration to legitimate their rule, later authorities often resorted to harder measures, heavier punishments, more overt displays of force, and grander ceremonial gestures. Such measures could restore order in the short term, but eroded the softer bonds of reciprocity that had sustained compliance. At the same time, cultural exchange continued to produce cosmopolitan elites who read Greek plays in Anatolian cities or participated in Babylonian scribal culture. This cultural mixing produced hybrid elites whose loyalties were often complex and shifted with political winds. The 5th and 4th centuries BCE also saw the empire confronted by a new kind of political actor: Alexander of Macedon's successors and Greek mercenary adventurers, and internal Persian upstarts. The famous case of Cyrus the Younger, a Persian prince who mounted a revolt against his brother Artaxerxes II and hired a force of Greek mercenaries that marched deep into the empire, illustrates the problem. Cyrus's attempt, culminating in the Battle of Cunaxa, 401 BCE, exposed 2 trends in Persian decline: internal dynastic divisions that could be exploited by elite claimants, and the way Greek military professionals had become available as instruments of internal Persian politics. When mercenaries, like those who later produced Xenophon's Anabasis, could move through Persian territory with relative ease, the integrity of imperial control was visibly compromised. Corruption and the personalization of power vitiated institutions further. Officials who were supposed to act as neutral administrators sometimes used their positions for private enrichment. Tribute assessments became occasions for graft, and legal decisions tilted toward those with courtly influence. Bureaucratic decay is rarely arresting in the moment, but over years it hollowed out administrative credibility. When peasants, merchants, and local priests saw officials as extractive rather than protective, the moral legitimacy of imperial rule diminished. That delegitimization made it easier for challengers to present alternatives, from local dynasts claiming traditional ritual authority to charismatic generals promising stability and spoils.
Demography and resource depletion played quieter roles. Population movements, whether induced by war, seasonal change, or economic opportunity, shifted the balance of productive regions. Agricultural regions damaged by war or overtaxed by extraction produced lower yields. Environmental pressures, including drought and soil exhaustion in some locales, added to the fiscal stress. The imperial center that demanded constant tribute found itself increasingly asking less and getting less in return. The crown then faced an uncomfortable choice: raise levies and risk revolt, or reduce spending and risk losing military edge. Religion and ideology both sustained and destabilized the empire. Zoroastrian concepts gave the kings a rhetorical frame, the king as upholder of order against chaos. Yet pluralism meant that different regions retained their own priesthoods and mythic frameworks. The crown's reliance on local religious legitimation, temple rituals, priestly endorsements, meant that any alienation of religious classes had political consequences. When priesthoods perceived Persian rule as sacrilegious or as failing to protect sacred precincts, they could mobilize resistance or withdraw cooperation. One of the most consequential consequences of this slow unraveling was political mimicry. Regions began to emulate Persian governance locally, creating their own satrapal households, coinage, and administrative practices. This diffusion of statecraft was paradoxical. It reflected the spread and prestige of Persian administrative knowledge, but it also meant that the tools of empire were available to potential rivals. Anatolian nobles who had learned to run satrapal treasuries could repurpose those systems to found local dynasties. Egyptian leaders who had learned Persian fiscal patterns could bargain more effectively with the crown. The efficacy of Persian institutions therefore contributed to their dilution when those institutions passed into other hands. Still, a note of complexity is essential. The empire's decline was not uniform. It was punctuated by recoveries and reforms. Strong kings occasionally reasserted authority. Local revolts were sometimes crushed, and trade and cultural life continued to flourish in many regions. The empire retained considerable capability, minting coins, building monuments, and projecting military force when necessary. Yet the pattern was unmistakable. The glue that had once bound provinces into a functioning whole was thinning. That thinning created opportunity. Ambitious figures, both inside and outside the imperial orbit, now saw possibilities that had been unthinkable a century earlier. The empire's administrative breadth and cultural reach had created a common political space across which new actors, leaders schooled in Persian practice, Greek commanders with Macedonian discipline, and regional strongmen could move. The slow erosion of central authority therefore became a precondition for more dramatic upheavals to come. When Alexander of Macedon finally arrived on the Persian doorstep, he did not topple an empire that had already fallen. He confronted a polity that remained formidable, but whose internal coherence had been weakened by decades of attrition. In that sense, Persia's silent decline was not a single event, but a set of vulnerabilities accumulated over time. Administrative drift, fiscal strain, the rising power of satraps, the availability of mercenaries, and the erosion of moral legitimacy. Those weaknesses did not make overthrow inevitable, but they made it possible. Cinematically, the empire's decline is a quieter drama than an explosive conquest. It is the empire in the palace at dusk, ledgers half-filled, couriers delayed by rain, a satrap suspected of amassing private troops, a temple's priests grumbling about levies, and a royal decree arriving too late to be obeyed. It is the accumulation of ordinary failings that together change the balance of power. The Achaemenids remained rulers of a spectacular world of art and architecture, but the invisible scaffolding that had once held that spectacle together was slowly coming undone. This chapter asks us to consider a sobering truth about great polities, that longevity depends as much on daily administrative competence and moral credibility as on grand victories. The Persian Empire's silent decline teaches that an empire's fall can be the result of erosion as much as catastrophe, a lesson that resonates across history and provides the context for the final shockwaves that would soon wash across the Near East.
Empires leave traces in roads, in laws, in coins, in the way temples are tended, but some leave their end as an event that rewrites maps and memories. Alexander of Macedon did not invent a total break, so much as accelerate a change whose seams had been widening for decades. His arrival exposed the vulnerabilities laid out in the previous chapter, and his lightning campaigns remade political geography. Yet the collapse of Achaemenid political power was as much about absorption as annihilation. Persia's instruments of rule proved irresistible and essential to Alexander and the generations that followed. The fall of Darius III was a seismic moment. The real story is how Persia's administrative genius entered the bloodstream of the post-Alexandrian world.
The invasion that changed everything began with a Macedonian accustomed to audacity. Alexander crossed into Asia Minor in 334 BCE with a compact, superbly trained army forged by Philip II's reforms. Combined arms, heavy cavalry, flexible phalanxes, and officers used to marching long distances under brutal discipline. He confronted not a disorganized foe, but a sophisticated imperial system that still possessed resources, fortresses, and regional elites. The first major encounter came at the river Granicus. Alexander's decisive, frontal charge shattered Persian satrapal contingents and signaled that the emperor's periphery could be vulnerable to bold, well-led shock tactics. But Granicus was a beginning, not a finale. Across Anatolia and down the Levant, Alexander moved with a blend of military speed and political theater. He took cities with force, but also with calculated clemency, presenting himself as liberator and successor. At Issus in 333 BCE, he faced Darius III in pitched battle. There, the Persian king's larger but less cohesive army was routed when Macedonian tactics exploited gaps and flaws in coordination. Darius fled, a pattern that would repeat as he tried to hold together an empire of many tongues under the pressure of sudden, concentrated assaults. Alexander's pursuit pressed him into Mesopotamia and then into the heartland, culminating in the catastrophic engagement at Gaugamela in 331 BCE. Darius assembled a massive force, arraying 5 chariots and diverse levies across a wide plain suited to maneuver. Alexander countered with disciplined formations and a tactical plan aimed at piercing the imperial center. The Macedonian charge broke through, Darius fled once more, and the imperial center, already weakened by internal strains, suffered a mortal blow. The bejeweled crowns and palaces could be taken, the symbolic heart of dynastic authority faltered without a secure monarch to embody continuity. But military victory did not equate to instant total control. Darius's flight, capture plots, and eventual murder at the hands of his own satraps and the rebel Bessus, who hoped to claim power himself, revealed the brittle web of loyalty that once supported the Achaemenid throne. Internal betrayals, satraps turning against the center, ambitious nobles seeking local dynastic claims, accelerated collapse. When Bessus mutilated Darius and attempted to usurp the title, he did not so much restore imperial coherence as create a new theater of conflict. Alexander pursued him both to claim vengeance and to eliminate a rival claimant whose actions made the notion of Persian kingship messy and delegitimized. And here we reach the symbolic rupture that has attracted centuries of debate, the burning of Persepolis in 330 BCE. The image is cinematic, roofs aflame, carved stairways blackened, treasure houses looted. Ancient accounts vary in motive. Was it a calculated political act to break the spirit of Persian royal cults? A punitive revenge for Xerxes' earlier burning of Athens' sacred places? Or an intoxicated decision by Alexander and his officers during a banquet? The truth is probably mixed. The act had elements of revenge, of opportunism, and of political theater. The destruction served as a visible end to the old ceremonial center, yet it was not total erasure. Persepolis's administrative records, art styles, satrapal structures, and the very administrative techniques that had governed the empire persisted elsewhere and in other forms. That persistence is the paradox at the heart of this chapter. Alexander's real genius, whether cynical or pragmatic, was to grasp that winning hearts required more than raising palaces. He adopted Persian court practices, incorporated Persian troops into his ranks, and married into Persian nobility. The mass weddings at Susa in 324 BCE, in which Alexander arranged marriages between his officers and Persian noblewomen, were theatrical politics designed to fuse Macedonian martial energy with Persian legitimacy. Alexander himself married Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman, and later married Statera and Parasatis at Susa. acts intended to bind the Macedonian dynasty to Persian royal lines. He kept satrapal frameworks intact in many regions, using local administrators to collect revenue and manage day-to-day rule. In other words, Alexander was not just a destroyer, he was a savvy appropriator. Administratively, the Hellenistic successor states would learn from Persian techniques more than they would from Macedonian improvisation. The satrapy, the idea of provincial governors with fiscal responsibilities, the use of imperial archives and standardized coinage, and a bureaucratic staff steeped in Aramaic and native administrative traditions were too useful to be discarded. Seleucus, one of Alexander's foremost successors, built a realm that explicitly mixed Hellenic and Persian practices across the Near East. Where Seleucid control was strong, the imperial machine of taxes, roads, and official language functioned along familiar Persian lines. Even when Greek became an administrative language in some places, the personnel, scribes, tax collectors, and local elites often came from the Persian administrative milieu.
The military fusion was likewise significant. Alexander and later Hellenistic kings employed Persian cavalry and local levies and increasingly integrated Eastern troops and officers into mixed formations. The availability of Persian-style cavalry and the techniques of managing multi-ethnic contingents were inherited, adapted, and employed by new regimes. In short, Persia's military and administrative DNA did not vanish, it changed owners. The cultural afterlife of Achaemenid rule also deserves emphasis. Persian art forms, ceremonial court practices, and palace iconography influenced Hellenistic tastes. Relief scenes of delegations, throne room order, and courtly processionals continued and hybridized motifs across the successor kingdoms. Moreover, local elites who had grown comfortable under Persian rule experienced continuity when the Hellenistic kings used the same aristocratic networks for governance. Temple cults resumed, tributary sequences continued, and local religious calendars were often respected. The continuity of everyday governance meant that for many people, the transition from Persian to Macedonian to Seleucid or Parthian rule was experienced more as a change of top-layer authority than as a complete civilizational rupture. The symbolic end of the Achaemenid political family did not end Eastern expressions of Persian statecraft. In subsequent centuries, new Persian polities would rise, most notably the Parthian and Sasanian states, which explicitly reclaimed and reinterpreted aspects of Achaemenid heritage. These later Iranian dynasties readopted the language of imperial kingship, ceremonial regalia, and territorial ambition, showing that Persian concepts of rulership had staying power and that the successor states saw legitimacy in claiming continuity with the Achaemenid past. Beyond the Near East, the transmission of Persian administrative models filtered into Mediterranean political thought as well. Greek historians, dramatists, and philosophers absorbed Persian examples in their reflections on monarchy, law, and statecraft. Through Hellenistic intermediaries, Roman officials later encountered centralized administrative techniques, standing treasure systems, and monetary practices that had antecedents in Persian governance. Rome's later interactions with Parthia and Sasanian Persia would be shaped by a recognition that a resilient, sophisticated Eastern imperial model existed, one built on centuries of Achaemenid precedent. But to say the empire lived on through its techniques is also to note the shift in who remembered and why. In Western historical memory, Greco-Roman literatures came to dominate the telling of the ancient past. Their biases and literary shapes privileged Greek narratives of freedom and Roman narratives of legal continuity. The nuanced story of administrative continuity, how satraps, scribes, and khanats kept societies functioning, became less glorious to retell than stories of battles and great men. Yet, the practical legacy remained. Roads continued to be used, coins kept circulating, and administrative habits hardened into durable practices that later polities could retool. There is another human dimension to this transformation, the fate of populations.
For many subjected peoples, Babylonians, Egyptians, Anatolians, Persians living far from court, daily life sometimes changed little. New rulers often left temples intact, allowed cults to function, and preserved local laws. Where pillage occurred, it was often tied to the chaos of conquest rather than a systematic erasure of culture. In some regions, the elite classes adapted quickly, learning Greek in court circles and reconfiguring their patronage networks. In others, local customs continued for centuries with only a new imperial overseer. So the fall of Darius III and the burning of Persepolis marked the end of Achaemenid political sovereignty, but not the end of Achaemenid influence. Alexander's conquests closed one chapter, the dynasty of Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes, and opened another in which Persian institutions would be recycled, hybridized, and transplanted into a Hellenistic order. The dramatic end of the palace did not extinguish the infrastructure of empire. Roads, satrapies, coins, legal forms, and administrative personnel outlived dynasts and battles. Persia's genius for governing diversity, for moving wealth and message across immense spaces, had become a toolkit for later rulers. As the Near Eastern map rearranged itself into successor kingdoms and then into Roman, Parthian, Sasanian frontiers, the Achaemenid legacy endured as a set of practical answers to perennial questions: how to tax, how to move, how to adjudicate, how to secure borders, and how to symbolize authority. The empire that had once controlled the world before Rome did not vanish so much as bequeath the fundamental instruments of imperial rule to those who followed. The world shifted, politically, culturally, and morally, but Persia's imprint remained deep beneath the new orders that rose from its ashes.
When the flames of Persepolis faded and the last Achaemenid banners fell, the Persian Empire seemed, on the surface, to have vanished. But empires do not truly die when their palaces burn. They live on in the habits of governance, in the roads that still guide travelers, and in the invisible architectures of law, tolerance, and exchange that shape civilizations long after names are forgotten. The Persian Empire was one such inheritance, a political and moral blueprint for how humanity could rule vast diversity without extinguishing it. Long before Rome built its marble forums, or China raised its imperial walls, Persia had already answered the hardest questions of empire. How do you govern strangers without destroying their customs? How do you move wealth, justice, and knowledge across deserts and seas? How do you make an empire that people can live within, not merely fear? The Achaemenids solved these questions not through ideology, but through practicality, by building roads that carried both soldiers and merchants, by allowing nations to worship their own gods, and by insisting that administration, not annihilation, was the foundation of order. The echoes of Persia resounded far beyond its time. The Romans later adopted its courier system, its provincial governance, and its use of gold coinage as a symbol of imperial unity. Islamic caliphates, centuries later, would inherit Persian ideas of bureaucracy and the ethics of kingship, blending them with spiritual law. Even the modern nation-state, with its postal systems, taxation, and tolerance for pluralism, owes something to the pragmatic imagination first refined under Cyrus, Darius, and their successors. Yet Persia's greatest gift was not logistical, it was philosophical. In a world accustomed to conquest through destruction, the Achaemenids ruled through inclusion. They built an empire of cooperation where difference was managed rather than erased. That principle, so simple, so radical, became the moral thread that tied East and West in every age that followed. It is why the name of Cyrus endures not as a tyrant's, but as a liberator's. Today, standing before the ruins of Persepolis,
one sees not just the remnants of power, but the outline of an idea, that empire, at its best, can be an architecture of understanding rather than domination. The Persians proved that greatness is not measured only by conquest, but by the ability to build a world large enough to contain many worlds within it. In that sense, the Persian Empire never truly fell. It transformed, its spirit carried by those who came after, its lessons embedded in the empires that dreamed of eternity. Long before Rome claimed to rule the world, Persia had already shown humanity what the world could be when ruled with vision, order, and restraint. And in every enduring system of law, every great road that unites nations, every moment when mercy triumphs over destruction, Persia still speaks.